May 1946, Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada. The spring air smelled like fresh grass and diesel fuel from the trucks outside. Inside the wooden office at Camp 133, 3 boys stood in a line. They wore German army uniforms that had faded from dark gray to the color of old dishwater. The wool hung loose on their thin frames. Their boots were scuffed and worn. Each boy kept his eyes down, staring at the wooden floor. The Canadian officer behind the desk was Captain William Henderson. He was 45 years old with gray at his temples and deep lines around his eyes. He had fought in the First War. Now he processed prisoners going home from the Second. He looked at the papers in front of him, then up at the 3 boys. The oldest was barely 17. The youngest 2 were only 16. Richter, Hans, Henderson said, reading from his list. Weber, Klaus, Schultz, Friedrich. He spoke slowly so they could understand his English. Your transport to Halifax leaves in 3 days, June 15th. From there you sail to Britain, then home to Germany. The boys did not move. The middle one, Hans Richter, had blonde hair that fell across his forehead. His hands were rough and calloused from farm work. He raised his head and looked directly at the captain. His blue eyes were steady. "We want to stay in Canada," Hans said. His English was broken but clear enough. "Please, sir, we do not go back." Henderson blinked. In 2 years of running this camp, he had seen many things. But this was new. 3 teenage enemy soldiers refusing repatriation, choosing to stay behind barbed wire rather than go home. "Son," Henderson said carefully, "you don't understand. The war is over. You're going home." Klaus Weber stepped forward. He was taller than the others, with dark hair and serious brown eyes. He held a folder of papers against his chest. "Sir, I have university papers. From Saskatchewan. I study here. In Germany, there is nothing." The 3rd boy, Friedrich Schultz, said nothing. He was the smallest, with red hair and freckles across his nose. His hands shook slightly. He looked like he might cry. This moment was stranger than most people could imagine. To understand how impossible this scene was, you need to know what the world looked like in May 1946. Exactly 1 year earlier, Germany had surrendered. The Third Reich was dead. Adolf Hitler had killed himself in his bunker in Berlin. The war that had killed 60 million people was finally over, but Europe was destroyed. Germany was split into 4 pieces, controlled by America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Berlin was a field of rubble. Hamburg was ruins. Dresden was ash. Millions of people wandered the roads with no homes to return to. Food was scarce. Children starved in the streets. Former soldiers faced shame and suspicion everywhere they went. Germany was a wasteland of broken buildings and broken dreams. Meanwhile, here in southern Alberta, Camp 133 still stood. It covered 720 acres of flat prairie land just outside Lethbridge. Rows of wooden barracks stretched as far as the eye could see. Guard towers rose 30 feet high at each corner. 2 layers of barbed wire fence surrounded the entire compound. This was the largest prisoner of war camp in all of North America. At its peak, it had held 12,500 German prisoners. Now, in May 1946, over 10,000 still remained. Most were regular soldiers, U-boat crews, paratroopers, tank drivers, men in their 20s and 30s who had been captured in North Africa, Italy, France. But hidden among them were approximately 300 teenagers. Some were 17 or 18, some were 16. A few were only 15 years old. They had been swept up in the final desperate months of the war, when Germany ran out of men and started taking boys. These were not hardened warriors. They were children in uniforms. They had been in the Hitler Youth, learning to march and salute and worship the Führer since age 10. Then, when Germany was losing badly, the army grabbed them straight from youth camps and handed them rifles. Most lasted only weeks before capture. Now they sat in Canadian prison camps, thousands of miles from home, still trying to understand what had happened to their world. The Canadian government faced a problem it had never expected. Britain wanted every single German prisoner sent back immediately. No exceptions. No delays. The British were clear, repatriate them all, but thousands of Germans were begging to stay. They had written letters, they had filed petitions, they had found Canadian farmers and families willing to sponsor them. And now these three boys stood in Henderson's office, refusing to leave. How did this happen? How did enemy soldiers, boys who had been trained to hate and kill, come to love the country holding them prisoner? What could possibly have occurred in the 2 years between their capture and this moment to make them prefer Canadian barbed wire over returning to their own families? Hans Richter had joined the Hitler Youth in Hamburg when he was 10 years old. It was not a choice. Every German boy joined. They taught him that Germany was saving the world, that enemies were less than human, that dying for Hitler was the greatest honor. He believed every word because everyone around him believed. His teachers believed. His parents believed. The radio said it was true. Doubting meant punishment, so he never doubted. Klaus Weber from Munich learned the same lessons. Friedrich Schultz from Dresden heard the same lies. They competed in war games. They practiced shooting. They memorized Nazi speeches. They dreamed of the day they would fight for the fatherland. That day came in 1944 and 1945, when they were still children. They went to war. They fought. They were captured. And then something impossible happened. Captain Henderson looked at the three boys standing before him. He saw the hope in their eyes. He saw the fear. These were not monsters. They were scared kids who had been lied to their entire lives. He had a job to do. He had orders. But his heart ached for them. "Boys," he said quietly, "I cannot make this decision. This comes from Ottawa. From London. You are all going back." He paused. "I'm sorry." Hans Richter's face fell. Klaus Weber's shoulders slumped. Friedrich Schultz let out a small sound, almost a whimper. The war had ended. The killing had stopped. But for these three boys, the hardest battle was just beginning. To understand why three German boys refused to leave Canada in 1946, you need to know how they became soldiers in the first place. Their story started years earlier, when they were just children learning to hate. Hans Richter was 10 years old in 1940 when the Hitler Youth came to his school in Hamburg. A man in a brown uniform stood at the front of the classroom and announced that every boy must join. It was not a request. It was an order. The next Saturday, Hans put on his new uniform. Brown shirt, black shorts, a red armband with a black symbol on it. He felt proud. Everyone told him he should feel proud. The Hitler Youth was not like Boy Scouts. It was training for war. Hans learned to march in perfect lines. He learned to shoot rifles at targets shaped like enemy soldiers. He learned songs about dying for Germany. Every meeting started the same way. The boys raised their right arms straight out and shouted loyalty to Adolf Hitler. Hans shouted louder than anyone. He wanted to be the best. The leaders taught them history, but it was all lies. They said Germany lost the first war because of traitors and weak people. They said other countries wanted to destroy Germany. They said Jewish people were the enemy. They said Germans were better than everyone else. Hans believed it all. He was 10 years old. His teachers said it. His parents said it. The radio said it every day. How could it not be true? Klaus Weber in Munich learned the exact same things. So did Friedrich Schultz in Dresden. By the time they were 12, these boys could take apart a rifle and put it back together in under 2 minutes. They could read maps and use a compass. They could recognize enemy tanks from their silhouettes. They knew which races the Nazis said were inferior and which were acceptable. They had stopped thinking for themselves. They just believed what they were told. The Hitler youth camps felt like adventure. The boys hiked in the mountains. They competed in contests. They slept in tents and sang around campfires. But every song was about war. Every game practiced killing. Every story ended with a German hero dying gloriously for the fatherland. The boys dreamed of the day they could be real soldiers. They thought war was glorious. They had no idea what it actually meant. That day came much sooner than anyone expected. By late 1944, Germany was losing the war badly. The Americans had landed in France. The Russians were pushing from the east. German cities were being bombed every night. The army was running out of men, so they started taking boys. In October 1944, Heinz Richter turned 16. A letter arrived at his house. It said he was conscripted into the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend, the Hitler Youth Division. 2 weeks later, he left Hamburg wearing a real Wehrmacht uniform. His mother cried. His father shook his hand and told him to make Germany proud. Hans climbed onto a truck with 40 other teenage boys. None of them had ever been in real combat. Most had never even left their hometowns. The war was nothing like the songs promised. Hans arrived at the front in December 1944, just as Germany launched its last big attack in Belgium, the Battle of the Bulge. It was winter. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees below zero. Snow fell constantly. Hans's unit dug foxholes in frozen ground. His hands went numb. His feet hurt from frostbite. He had not eaten a hot meal in 3 days. Then the fighting started. Artillery shells screamed overhead and exploded in bursts of fire and dirt. Machine guns rattled without stopping. Officers screamed orders that made no sense. Boys died in the snow, crying for their mothers. Hans fired his rifle at shadows in the trees. He had no idea if he hit anyone. He just kept shooting because everyone around him was shooting. Hans lasted 4 months. On February 23, 1945, British forces attacked his position near the German town of Kleve. Tanks rolled forward. Shells fell like rain. Hans's sergeant was hit by shrapnel and fell screaming. The boy next to Hans dropped his rifle and ran. Hans wanted to run too. But there was nowhere to go. A British soldier appeared around the corner of a destroyed building. He pointed his rifle at Hans. Hans dropped his weapon and raised his hands. 40 other teenage soldiers did the same. They were boys pretending to be warriors, and they had lost. Hans was 16 years old and weighed 120 pounds. He still believed Germany would somehow win. He still believed Hitler would save them. Klaus Weber was captured 3 weeks later on March 15, 1945, when American forces crossed the Rhine River. Same story, different place. Fritz Schulz surrendered on May 2, 1945, in northern Germany. The war ended 5 days later. All 3 boys became prisoners. The British processed them through temporary camps in Europe. Then, because Britain had too many prisoners and not enough space, they put them on ships. The ships crossed the Atlantic Ocean to Canada. Hans, Klaus, and Fritz arrived in Halifax in the summer of 1945. They were tired, scared, and convinced they would be tortured or killed. Nazi propaganda had taught them that prisoners were treated terribly. Canadian guards loaded them onto trains. The trains rolled west for days across endless forests and prairies. Finally, they arrived in southern Alberta. The guards marched them through gates topped with barbed wire. This was Camp 133 Lethbridge. This was where they would spend the next year of their lives. None of the 3 boys could have guessed what would happen next. They expected punishment. They expected cruelty. They expected everything they had been taught about enemies. What they got instead changed them forever. When Hans Richter first walked through the gates of Camp 133 in June 1945, he expected to die. Everything the Hitler Youth had taught him said prisoners were tortured. The propaganda film showed Allied soldiers beating captives. The officers said enemies murdered Germans for fun. Hans kept his head down and waited for the beating to start. It never came. Instead, a Canadian guard led him to a wooden barracks. The building was clean. It had electric lights hanging from the ceiling. Bunk beds lined both walls, each with a mattress and 2 wool blankets. The guard pointed to an empty bed and said something in English. Hans did not understand the words, but the tone was not angry. The guard was not yelling. He was just explaining. Hans sat on the bed. It had springs that creaked under his weight. After 4 months sleeping in frozen foxholes, it felt like heaven. He waited for the trick. Surely this kindness was a trap. They would give him comfort, then take it away as punishment. Klaus Weber arrived 2 months later in August. He walked into the same camp and saw the same clean barracks. He saw German prisoners playing soccer on a grass field. He saw a building with a sign that said library. None of this made sense. Where was the cruelty? Where was the suffering? Friedrich Schultz came in late August, one of the last groups from Europe. The guards gave him a tin plate and led him to a dining hall. Hundreds of German prisoners sat at long tables eating dinner. Real food, bread, soup with vegetables and meat. Fritz had not seen meat in 6 months. His hands shook as he ate. He kept expecting someone to slap the food away. But the real crisis was not about comfort. It was about belief. These 3 boys had spent their entire lives being told what to think. Germany was great. Hitler was a hero. The war was noble. Now they sat behind barbed wire, defeated, and the old ideas still filled their heads. Hans kept a small photograph of Adolf Hitler hidden in his boot. At night, when the lights went out, he would take it out and look at it. He still believed. Germany had lost battles, but the war was not over. The Führer must have a plan. They just had to wait. Klaus still gave the stiff-armed Nazi salute when talking to older German prisoners. It was habit. It was what he knew. When guards saw him do it, they frowned but did not punish him. That confused Klaus even more. Why did the enemy allow this? Fritz cried when guards took away his Hitler Youth dagger during processing. The dagger had his name engraved on it. It was a prize for being excellent in training. Losing it felt like losing part of himself. Camp 133 held over 12,000 German prisoners. Most were older soldiers who had fought for years. Many were still committed Nazis. They created their own hierarchy inside the camp. The hardcore believers ran things. They enforced rules. They punished anyone who spoke against Germany or questioned Hitler. 2 prisoners at a different camp had been murdered by fellow Germans for saying the war was wrong. Everyone knew that story. It made boys like Hans, Klaus, and Fritz afraid to speak their doubts out loud. But doubts were growing. The Canadian Guards let prisoners listen to radios. The BBC broadcast news in German. The boys heard reports about Germany's cities being destroyed. They heard about the surrender. They heard about refugees flooding the roads with nowhere to go. Each broadcast made the old beliefs harder to hold. Then came the day that broke them. In late August 1945, Canadian authorities showed all prisoners a film. It was footage from liberated concentration camps. The projector flickered to life in the camp theater. The screen showed piles of dead bodies, skeletons with skin stretched over bones. Huge ovens for burning corpses, survivors so thin they looked like ghosts. The narrator said these were death camps. The narrator said Germany had systematically murdered 6 million Jewish people. 6 million. The number was too big to understand. The images were too horrible to believe. Hans Richter threw up. He ran outside and vomited in the dirt behind the building. His whole body shook. Klaus Weber sat frozen in his seat, unable to move. Tears ran down his face. Friedrich Schultz made a small choking sound and covered his eyes with his hands. The guards said this was what Germany had done. This was what the boys had been fighting for. This was the truth behind all the noble speeches and patriotic songs. Hans walked back to his barracks in a daze. Everything he had believed was a lie. Every teacher had lied. Every leader had lied. The Führer was not a hero. He was a monster, and Hans had served him willingly. He had worn the uniform with pride. He had saluted and marched and fired his rifle, all for this. That night, Hans took the photograph of Hitler from his boot. He stared at it for a long time. Then he tore it into tiny pieces and threw them in the garbage. Klaus stopped giving the Nazi salute. Fritz stopped asking about his dagger. All three boys felt empty inside. If everything they had believed was false, what was true? Who were they? They were not heroes. They were not even soldiers. They were just scared children who had been used by evil men. The crisis went deeper than shame. It was about survival. Their cities were rubble. Their families were scattered or dead. Even if they went home, what future waited for them? What kind of life could a former Nazi child soldier have in a defeated, destroyed Germany? They were prisoners behind barbed wire in a foreign country. But that wire was starting to feel less like a cage and more like protection. Outside was a world that hated them. Inside was safety, food, and something they had never experienced before. People who treated them like human beings worth saving. The question was not whether they wanted to stay. The question was whether anyone would let them. The turning point did not happen all at once. It came in small moments scattered across months, like drops of water slowly filling a cup. Each drop changed the boys a little more, until one day they looked back and realized they were completely different people. For Hans Richter, everything changed on a farm. In October 1945, Canadian authorities announced that low-risk prisoners could work outside the camp. Farmers needed help with harvest. The government would pay prisoners 20 cents per day. Hans raised his hand to volunteer. Anything to get outside the barbed wire, even for a few hours. They assigned him to Joseph Kowalski's farm, 7 miles west of Lethbridge. Joseph was 55 years old with thick arms and a weathered face. His family had come from Ukraine in the 1920s, fleeing their own war. Joseph needed help bringing in wheat before winter came. On the first morning, a truck dropped Hans at the farm gate. Joseph walked out to meet him. Hans stood stiffly, waiting for orders. Joseph looked him up and down, then smiled. "You are just a boy," he said in accented English. "Come, we eat first." Hans followed Joseph into the farmhouse. The kitchen smelled like fresh bread and coffee. Joseph's wife, Anna, stood at the stove. She turned and saw Hans in his faded German uniform. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Anna pulled out a chair at the table. "Sit," she said. "You must be hungry." They gave him eggs, real eggs fried in butter, thick slices of bread with jam, a glass of cold milk. Hans ate slowly, waiting for them to take it away. They never did. When he finished, Joseph handed him a cup of coffee and explained the day's work. No yelling, no threats, just simple instructions. Hans worked that farm 6 days a week through fall and winter. He drove the tractor. He fixed fences. He helped Joseph repair the barn roof before snow came. Every day, Anna made him lunch. Every day, they ate together at the family table like he belonged there. They had a daughter named Margaret, 14 years old, with dark braids and bright eyes. She practiced her English with Hans, teaching him new words. When Hans made mistakes, she laughed kindly and corrected him. At the end of each day, Joseph paid him 4 Canadian coins, adding up to 20 cents. It was almost nothing, but it meant everything. Joseph was paying him like a worker, not treating him like property. One day in December, Joseph said quietly, "You are just a boy. This war was not your fault." Hans went back to his barracks that night and cried for the first time since capture. Klaus Weber found his transformation in a different place. In November 1945, camp authorities announced that prisoners could take university classes. The program worked with the University of Saskatchewan. Professors would grade their work by mail. Prisoners could study engineering, mathematics, languages, anything they wanted. Klaus signed up immediately. Before the war, he had dreamed of becoming an engineer. His father had been a mechanic in Munich. Klaus loved taking things apart to see how they worked. Now, behind barbed wire, he could actually study it properly. They gave him real textbooks, heavy books with hundreds of pages about physics and mathematics. The camp set aside a heated room for studying. Klaus spent every free hour there, working through equations, drawing diagrams, teaching himself things he never learned in school. His first exam came back with a grade of 92%. The professor had written at the top, "Excellent work. Keep going." Klaus stared at those words for 10 minutes. Someone believed in him. Someone thought he had a future worth developing. In Germany, former Hitler Youth soldiers had no future. Here, people were helping him build one. Friedrich Schultz discovered something unexpected. Camp 133 had an orchestra. 30 German prisoners who had been professional musicians before the war. They practiced twice a week in the camp theater. One day, Fritz walked past during rehearsal and heard violin music drifting through the door. It was Beethoven, a piece his mother used to play. Fritz had studied violin since he was 6 years old. Both his parents were music teachers in Dresden. He had not touched a violin since being conscripted. He thought that part of his life was dead. But hearing that music awakened something in him. He asked the orchestra leader if he could join. The man handed him a violin and some sheet music. "Show me what you can do," he said. Fritz played. His fingers remembered what his mind had forgotten. The music poured out of him, and for 3 minutes he was not a prisoner or a former soldier. He was just a boy playing violin. The orchestra accepted him. They practiced Bach and Mozart and Brahms. The camp commandant even allowed them to perform concerts. Some were for prisoners only, but twice they played for people from Lethbridge. Fritz could not believe it. German prisoners performing for Canadian civilians whose sons had died fighting Germans. After one concert in February 1946, an older Canadian woman approached Fritz. She had white hair and kind eyes. "My son died at Normandy," she said quietly. Fritz's stomach twisted. He wanted to run, but she continued, "I came tonight because music belongs to everyone, not just one country. You played beautifully. Thank you." Fritz did not know what to say. This woman had lost her son to German bullets, yet she thanked him for playing violin. The grace of it was too much to understand. Hey, quick pause here. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like these deserve to be heard, and look where we're at now, dreaming of 100,000 subscribers. Help me show her that these videos matter. Please subscribe to my channel Canadians at War, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. In March 1946, Hans, Klaus, and Fritz met during Sunday recreation time. They had become friends, recognizing each other as the youngest prisoners in camp. They sat on a bench near the fence, watching snow melt in the spring sun. Hans spoke first. I do not want to go back to Germany. His voice was quiet but firm. Klaus nodded. My family's gone. Dresden is gone. There is nothing there. Fritz looked at his hands. My father is dead. My mother has nothing. What can I give her if I return another mouth to feed? They sat in silence for a moment. Then Hans said what they were all thinking. What if we try to stay here? It sounded crazy. They were enemy soldiers. They were prisoners. But they had tasted something in Canada they had never known in Germany. Hans had experienced kindness from people who should hate him. Klaus had been given education and a chance at a real future. Fritz had found grace from a woman who had every right to curse him. When they try to send us back, Klaus said slowly, we refuse. We ask to stay, Fritz added. We beg if we have to, Hans finished. They made a pact that afternoon. When repatriation came, they would not go quietly. They would fight to stay in the country that had shown them what they could become, instead of punishing them for what they had been. They whispered it in German, a promise to each other. We stay here, no matter what. None of them knew if it was possible. But for the first time since the war started, they had hope. And hope, they were learning, was worth fighting for. The repatriation orders arrived in early May 1946. A clerk posted lists on the wall outside the camp office. Hundreds of names in alphabetical order. Each name had a date next to it. The dates were all in June. Hans found his name halfway down the second page. Richter, Hans. June 15th. Klaus found his name on the same list. Weber, Klaus. June 15th. Fritz's was there too. Schultz, Friedrich. June 15th. All around them, prisoners reacted in different ways. Some cheered. They were finally going home after years behind wire. Others stood silent, staring at the lists like they were reading death sentences. A few walked away without checking at all, as if not seeing their names would make repatriation disappear. Hans felt his chest tighten. 3 weeks. They had 3 weeks until the trucks came to take them to the train station. 3 weeks until they lost everything they had built here. That afternoon, the 3 boys made their move. They asked to speak with Lieutenant Colonel James McLeod, the camp commandant. McLeod was a tall man with gray hair and a thick mustache. He had run Camp 133 since 1944. The guards said he was fair but strict. He followed the rules exactly. The boys stood in his office, nervous and sweating, despite the cool spring air. A translator stood beside McLeod's desk. Hans spoke in German, and the translator turned his words into English. Sir, we want to stay in Canada, Hans said. His voice shook, but held steady. We do not wish to return to Germany. We have sponsors. We have work. Please, let us stay. McLeod leaned back in his chair. He had expected this conversation. In the past month, hundreds of prisoners had made similar requests. Some were serious, some were desperate, all were impossible to grant. Hans pulled out a letter. It was written on plain paper in careful handwriting. Joseph Kowalski had written it himself. The letter said Hans was a good worker. It said Joseph's farm needed him. It said the Kowalski family would sponsor Hans for immigration and take responsibility for him. Joseph had even gone to his member of parliament to file the request officially. Klaus had his university transcripts. He spread them on McLeod's desk. Grades of 88, 92, 95 in engineering courses. A letter from a University of Saskatchewan professor saying Klaus showed excellent promise. Another letter from a Lethbridge factory owner saying he would hire Klaus as an apprentice if allowed. Fritz had a letter from the conductor of the Lethbridge Symphony. It said Fritz played violin beautifully and would be welcomed as a member if he could stay. It was signed by 3 other musicians who had heard him play. McLeod looked at the papers spread before him. He rubbed his forehead. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. Boys, he said, waiting for the translator to catch up. "I understand what you're asking. I can see you have worked hard here. I can see people have spoken well of you." He paused. "But this decision is not mine to make. The British government has ordered all prisoners returned. Canada has agreed. The law requires repatriation." "But, sir," Klaus said desperately, "Germany has nothing for us. No homes, no schools, no future." "I know," MacLeod said quietly. "I'm sorry, but I have my orders. You will be on the June 15th transport." The boys left his office with heavy hearts, but they did not give up. They wrote letters to everyone they could think of. Hans wrote to Joseph Kowalski, begging for help. Klaus wrote to his university professors. Fritz wrote to the symphony conductor. They contacted the Red Cross. They asked other prisoners who had lawyers to file petitions. Joseph Kowalski did everything he could. He drove to Lethbridge and went to the office of his member of parliament. He explained about Hans, about how the boy had worked his farm faithfully for 6 months, about how he needed the help. The politician listened politely and said he would look into it. Joseph wrote letters to the immigration department in Ottawa. He told them Hans deserved a chance. Other farmers did the same for other prisoners. Hundreds of Canadians wrote letters supporting German POWs who had worked for them. They said these men were good workers. They said the country needed labor. They said these prisoners had proven themselves trustworthy. But the public was split. The Lethbridge Herald printed editorials on both sides. One writer argued that prisoners who had worked hard deserved consideration. Canada's economy was growing fast. Immigration could help. These men had shown they could contribute. But other voices were louder and angrier. Letters poured into the newspaper office. One woman wrote, "My son died, fighting these people at Normandy. Now you want to let them stay in his country? Never." Another said, "They were Nazis. They do not deserve Canadian citizenship." A veteran wrote, "I lost 3 friends to German bullets. Letting them stay is a slap in the face to everyone who served." The Canadian Legion held its annual meeting and passed a resolution. No German prisoners should be allowed to stay. None. The members voted almost unanimously. These were men who had fought in the trenches, who had seen friends die, who had suffered in combat. They could not forgive. But some veterans disagreed. One man from Calgary wrote to the Herald, "I fought in Normandy. I saw terrible things. But these boys are not responsible for Hitler's crimes. They were children, lied to and used. Give them a chance." His letter got shouted down by 100 others calling him a traitor. Hans, Klaus, and Fritz watched this debate from behind barbed wire. They had no vote, no voice. They could only wait and hope while Canadians argued about their fate. Inside the camp, reactions from fellow prisoners were mixed too. Some of the hardcore Nazis called the boys traitors. One older soldier spat at Hans in the dining hall. "Verräter," he hissed. "Traitor." He said real Germans would be proud to return home and rebuild the fatherland. Staying in an enemy country was shameful, but others understood. Rudolf Rees, a former U-boat sailor who had worked on the Kaser farm near Lethbridge, pulled Hans aside one evening. "You are smart," Rees said quietly. "Germany has nothing for us now? If I could stay, I would too." Years later, Rees would do exactly that, returning to Canada as an immigrant. The days crawled by. May turned into early June. The boys kept hoping for a miracle. Maybe the government would change its mind. Maybe the letters would work. Maybe someone would fight for them. On June 8th, 1 week before the transport, MacLeod called them back to his office. They ran across the compound, hearts pounding. Maybe this was good news. Maybe they had won. MacLeod looked tired. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper. He spoke slowly, making sure they understood every word. "I have received the final answer from Ottawa," he said. "All prisoners will be repatriated as planned. No exceptions. The British government insists. You three will leave on the June 15th transport to Halifax. From there, you sail to Britain, then to Germany." He paused, watching their faces crumble. "I am truly sorry, boys. I wish I could do more." Haynes felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. He grabbed the edge of McLeod's desk to stay standing. Klaus stared straight ahead, his face blank with shock. Fritz made a small, choking sound and covered his mouth with his hand. They walked out of the office into bright June sunshine. The sky was clear and blue. Birds sang in the trees beyond the fence. It was a beautiful day. But none of them noticed. That night, Fritz played his violin in the barracks. He chose a sad German folk song his mother had taught him years ago. The melody was slow and mournful. Every prisoner in the building stopped talking and listened. The music said everything the boys could not put into words. They were losing the only home they had ever truly known, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The story of three boys refusing to leave Canada was part of something much bigger. Hans, Klaus, and Fritz did not know it, but they were caught up in a problem the Canadian government never expected to have. The problem was simple. Their prisoner of war camps had worked too well. When Britain first sent German prisoners to Canada in 1940, the plan was basic. Keep them far from Europe where they could not escape back to Germany. Feed them, house them, guard them. Follow the Geneva Convention rules about treating prisoners fairly. That was it. Nobody planned for what actually happened. Of the 35,000 German prisoners held in Canada during the war, 6,000 asked to stay when it ended. 6,000 men who wanted to become immigrants instead of going home. This was not a small number. This was not a few special cases. This was nearly 1 in every 5 prisoners choosing Canada over Germany. How did this happen? The answer lay in decisions Canadian authorities made years earlier. Decisions that seemed simple at the time, but changed everything. In 1940, when the first prisoners arrived, Canada faced a choice. They could run brutal camps that barely met minimum standards, or they could follow the Geneva Convention strictly and treat prisoners with real dignity. Canada chose dignity. Then they went even further. They offered education, university classes by mail. Prisoners could study engineering, languages, mathematics, anything they wanted. One prisoner later said he finished top of his class in Germany after the war because of the education he got in a Canadian POW camp. They allowed work. By 1944, over 11,000 prisoners worked outside the camps. They cut trees in forests. They harvested crops on farms. They worked in factories. The government paid them small wages, 20 cents per day. It was not much, but it was payment. It was respect. They encouraged recreation. Camps had orchestras, theater groups, sports teams. Prisoners played soccer on grass fields. They performed concerts. They built libraries with thousands of books. Some camps were nicer than the barracks Canadian soldiers lived in. Most importantly, Canadian authorities started a program to change how prisoners thought. They called it re-education, but really it was just showing prisoners the truth. Guards let them listen to uncensored radio broadcasts. They showed them newspapers with real news, not propaganda. They screened films from liberated concentration camps, forcing prisoners to see what Nazi Germany had actually done. The goal was not punishment, it was transformation. Canadian authorities believed you could not defeat an evil idea just by defeating its army. You had to defeat the idea itself. You had to show people there was a better way to live. And it worked, almost too well. Prisoners compared life in Canadian camps to life in Germany before the war. Many came from poverty and unemployment. They remembered the chaos of the 1920s, the hunger, the desperation that made Hitler's promises seem attractive. In Canada, they saw prosperity. They saw democracy working. They saw people who were not crushed by fear or controlled by lies. The economic impact was huge. Canada needed workers desperately. Most Canadian men were overseas fighting. Farms needed harvest help. Factories needed hands. German prisoners filled those gaps. Farmers especially loved the arrangement. Many prisoners came from farms themselves. They knew the work. They were reliable and skilled. Men like Joseph Kowalski wrote letters praising their German workers. They asked for specific prisoners by name. They offered to sponsor them for immigration. Hundreds of Canadian farmers did the same thing. They saw these prisoners not as enemies, but as good workers who could help build the country. There was also a strategic reason Canada treated prisoners well, even if nobody said it out loud. By 1946, the war with Germany was over, but a new conflict was starting. The Soviet Union was becoming an enemy. West Germany would soon be an ally against communism. Former German soldiers who experienced Canadian kindness became unofficial ambassadors. They went home telling stories about democracy, about freedom, about countries where governments did not control every thought. One prisoner named Wilhelm Rahn was captured at age 19. Years later, he wrote that Canadian treatment destroyed his belief in Nazi ideas and showed him democracy could work. When he returned to Germany, he joined the new West German army as it allied with NATO. He remained grateful to Canada his whole life, even returning in 1967 for military training as a friend, not an enemy. But in June 1946, none of this mattered to the immediate problem. Britain wanted every prisoner back, period, no exceptions. There were several reasons why. First, Germany needed workers. The country was destroyed. Rebuilding required millions of hands. Every German prisoner sitting comfortably in Canada was one less worker rebuilding German cities. Second, the Geneva Convention required repatriation. International law said prisoners must go home when wars end. Keeping them was legally complicated. Third, letting former enemy soldiers immigrate while peace treaties were still being written created diplomatic headaches. What if some had committed war crimes? What if they were still dangerous? The British government did not want to take those risks. So Britain insisted. Every prisoner returns. Canada agreed publicly. But privately, some Canadian officials saw another way. Immigration Minister Paul Martin quietly let it be known that after repatriation, former prisoners would be welcome to apply for normal immigration. There was a loophole. Go back to Germany first, then apply to come to Canada properly. About 1,000 German ex-prisoners eventually did exactly that. They returned to Germany, spent months or years there, then filled out immigration forms and came back to Canada legally. Rudolf Rees, the U-boat sailor, returned to work for the Kaiser family. Horst Liebeck, a fighter pilot, became a builder in Ontario. Johann Pfeffel came back to Alberta, raised his family, and became a business owner. But this loophole required patience and money. You had to survive in destroyed Germany long enough to save for the trip back. You had to wait for Canadian immigration to process your application. You had to hope the opportunity stayed open. Many prisoners wanted to try but could not afford it. Many gave up and rebuilt their lives in Germany instead. And in June 1946, Hans, Klaus, and Fritz knew nothing about this future possibility. All they knew was the order to leave. All they could see was the end of everything they had built. The studies, the work, the kindness, the hope. All of it would disappear when they boarded the train to Halifax. Canada's prisoner of war program had succeeded in transforming enemy soldiers into men who loved their captors' country more than their own homeland. But now that success created an impossible situation. How do you force people to leave who desperately want to stay? How do you send teenagers back to ruins when they have found a home behind your barbed wire? The Canadian government had no good answer. They had orders to follow, laws to obey, Britain to satisfy. So they did what governments often do when faced with impossible choices. They followed the rules and hoped somehow it would work out for the best. They told themselves these prisoners could come back later through proper channels. They told themselves they had done all they could. But none of that helped three boys packing their few belongings in a Lethbridge barracks, knowing they had 1 week left before losing everything. The final week at Camp 133 felt like watching a clock count down to something terrible. Hans spent his days writing letters. He wrote to Joseph Kowalski, thanking him for changing his life. He wrote to Lieutenant Colonel MacLeod, one last plea for mercy that he knew would go nowhere. He wrote to his mother in Hamburg, warning her he was coming home but would not stay long. He promised to find a way back to Canada somehow. Klaus packed his few possessions into a canvas bag. University textbooks from Saskatchewan, certificates showing he had completed engineering courses with top marks, a photograph of the camp orchestra. These were proof he had become someone new, someone with skills and knowledge. He wrapped them carefully, hoping they would mean something in Germany, even though he knew they probably would not. Fritz played his violin every night that last week. He chose pieces that meant something. Beethoven, Bach, Mozart. The music his mother had taught him before the war destroyed everything. The other prisoners gathered to listen. Even some of the guards came to stand quietly outside the barracks. Everyone knew what the music meant. It was goodbye. On June 13th, 2 days before departure, Joseph Kowalski came to the camp one final time. Regulations said civilians could not enter the compound, so he stood outside the fence. Hans walked across the yard to meet him. Wire separated them, but Joseph reached his thick, calloused hand through and gripped Hans's fingers. "You worked hard for me," Joseph said, his English slow and careful. "You are a good boy. Not your fault what happened." He paused, making sure Hans understood every word. "When things get better, you come back. We sponsor you. You have a home here." Hans tried to speak, but could not. Tears ran down his face. He nodded, squeezed Joseph's hand once more, then walked away before he completely broke down. June 15th arrived with bright sunshine and clear skies. Morning roll call happened as always. Then guards called out names from a list. Richter, Weber, Schultz, 300 other names. All the prisoners scheduled for this transport. They lined up with their bags and marched to waiting trucks. The trucks drove them to the Lethbridge train station. A long train waited, made up of old passenger cars with wooden seats. Guards directed prisoners into the cars, 50 men to each one. Hans, Klaus, and Fritz stayed together. They found seats near a window and watched Lethbridge disappear as the train pulled away. The journey to Halifax took 4 days. The train rolled east across endless prairie, past fields of wheat turning gold in summer sun, past small towns with church steeples and grain elevators, past forests so thick you could not see through them. This was Canada, the country they had learned to love, passing by outside the window 1 mile at a time. Most prisoners felt relief. They were finally going home after years away. They talked about seeing families again, about rebuilding, about the future. But Hans, Klaus, and Fritz stayed quiet. They stared out windows and said little. At Halifax, guards marched them onto a ship, the RMS Mauritania, a huge ocean liner converted to carry troops and prisoners. They went below, decked to sleeping areas packed with bunks stacked 3 high. The air smelled like oil and salt water. The ship's engines rumbled under their feet. The crossing took 6 days. The Atlantic Ocean stretched forever in all directions. Gray water under gray sky. Hans got seasick the first 2 days and could barely eat. Klaus spent hours on deck watching waves, thinking about what waited in Germany. Fritz found a quiet corner and read one of his textbooks, over and over, like studying could somehow keep the future away. They landed in Britain on June 27th. British soldiers processed them through a camp, checking names against lists, sorting them by where they came from. Then more trains to more ports. Finally, in early July, they crossed into Germany. Hans arrived in Hamburg on July 3, 1946. The train station was half destroyed, the roof blown off by bombs. His mother met him on the platform. She barely recognized him. He had grown 4 inches and gained 30 pounds of muscle from farm work. He looked healthy and strong, but Hamburg destroyed him inside. Their apartment building was rubble. They lived in a basement with 2 other families, 7 people sharing 3 rooms. Food came from ration cards that gave you barely enough to survive. Lines for bread stretched for blocks. The black market had everything, but prices were crazy. Hans saw children begging in the streets, old people digging through garbage for scraps. Everywhere, the smell of decay and the dust of broken buildings. Klaus reached Munich to find Dresden was in the Soviet zone, completely cut off. He could not even go to his hometown. He ended up in a refugee camp on the edge of Munich. 20 people shared a tent. They stood in line for food every day. When his University of Saskatchewan certificates arrived in his bag, the camp manager glanced at them and laughed. "Mathematics? Nobody needs mathematics. We need bread." Fritz made it to Dresden. The city he remembered was gone. 75% destroyed by firebombing in February 1945. Block after block of ruins. His family's house was ash. His mother had survived, but looked like a ghost. His father had died in a Soviet prison camp. The beautiful violin his parents had given him for his 10th birthday was destroyed. Everything that made up his old life was simply erased. All 3 boys felt the same crushing weight. This was Germany now. This was what they had left Canada for. This was home, except it felt like nowhere. But Hans remembered Joseph's words, "Come back, you have a home here." Those words became his light in the darkness. In 1948, when things stabilized enough, Hans applied for Canadian immigration. He filled out every form. Joseph Kowalski wrote a letter promising work and sponsorship. In March 1949, approval came. Hans was 20 years old. He sailed to Canada, took a train to Lethbridge, and walked on to the Kowalski farm. Joseph met him at the gate and said, "Welcome home, son." Klaus applied in 1950. He finished his engineering degree at the University of Alberta, married a Canadian woman, and raised 4 children in Edmonton. He never went back to Germany. But Fritz never made it. His trauma ran too deep. He drank to forget. He could not rebuild. In 1958, age 29, Friedrich Schultz died in Dresden from liver failure. Before he died, he told his sister, "The happiest I ever was playing violin in Canada. I should have found a way back." Today, if you drive outside Lethbridge, Alberta, you will find almost nothing left of Camp 133. The barracks are gone. The guard towers are demolished. The double fence of barbed wire was torn down in 1947. The land went back to being prairie, just grass and sky like it was before the war. But there is a small monument. It sits on a quiet roadside where the camp entrance used to be. The stone is gray granite with words carved into it. The monument says that 12,500 German prisoners of war lived here between 1943 and 1946. It says they were treated with dignity, according to international law. It says some chose to return to Canada after the war and became citizens. That is all it says. Most Canadians who drive past do not stop. Most do not even know the story. Few people realize that their neighbors, their teachers, or their grandparents might have first come to Canada wearing a German uniform and sitting behind wire. The men who returned kept it quiet. The shame was too great. They told their children they immigrated after the war. They did not mention the part about being prisoners first, so the stories faded. The memories disappeared. An entire chapter of Canadian history became something almost nobody talked about. The legacy of Canada's German prisoner program is complicated. On one side, it showed Canada following the rules even when enemies did not. Canadian prisoners in German camps faced harsh treatment. Canadian prisoners in Japanese camps suffered terribly. Thousands died from starvation, disease, and brutality. But Canada chose the moral high ground. They treated German prisoners according to the Geneva Convention, even when Germany broke those same rules. This decision came from Canadian values. The country believed in fairness and law. They believed even enemies deserved basic human dignity. When Britain wanted to send prisoners to Canada in 1940, some Canadians worried. What if they escape? What if they cause trouble? But the government decided that doing the right thing mattered more than taking the easy path. On the other side, the program created painful tensions that never fully healed. Canadians who lost sons fighting Germans could not easily accept former enemies as neighbors. When those 1,000 ex-prisoners returned as immigrants in the late 1940s and 1950s, some communities welcomed them. Others did not. The Canadian Legion opposed it loudly. Veterans groups said letting former German soldiers become citizens was an insult to everyone who fought. Even today, when historians talk about this story, reactions are mixed. Some say Canada showed wisdom and mercy. Others say the country was too soft on people who had served evil. There is no simple answer. The truth holds both things at once. Canada was right to treat prisoners humanely, and Canadians were right to feel hurt and angry about it. But perhaps the deepest legacy is what the story teaches about change. Hans Richter was not a real person, but he represented hundreds of real boys. Boys who joined the Hitler Youth at 10 years old because they had no choice. Boys who believed Nazi lies because everyone around them believed. Boys who went to war as teenagers and were captured before they truly understood what they were fighting for. These were child soldiers, victims of propaganda. They had genuinely believed Germany was right. They had fired weapons in combat. They had been taught to hate. Yet, in just 2 years behind Canadian wire, surrounded by kindness they did not deserve and truth they had been denied, they changed completely. By 1946, they were not Nazis. They were traumatized boys trying to survive and build futures. This raises hard questions. At what age does a person become responsible for their choices? Were 16-year-old soldiers guilty of Germany's crimes, or were they victims too? If a teenager grows up in a system that controls every thought, can they be blamed for believing lies? And if they made terrible choices, can they be saved? Canada answered by offering second chances. The existence of 1,000 German ex-prisoners becoming Canadian citizens says something important. It says Canada believed people could change. It says environment shapes character. It says mercy matters more than revenge. Modern researchers studying Camp 133 point to it as an early example of changing how people think. Canadian authorities did not just lock up Germans. They actively worked to change their beliefs through education, truth, and kind treatment. The success was remarkable. interviews with returned prisoners showed most had completely rejected Nazi ideas by 1946. The program influenced how democracies deal with extremism. You cannot defeat a dangerous idea just by defeating its army. You have to defeat the idea itself. You have to show people a better way. Canada proved this works, even with people who seemed impossible to reach. There are small memorials beyond the Camp 133 marker. In Edmonton, a plaque honors immigrant contributions. Some ex-prisoners' names appear on it. In southern Alberta, families still tell stories of German workers who became part of their communities. Scattered across Canada are 67 gravesites of German prisoners who died in captivity. The Canadian government maintains them with the same care as Canadian war graves. Even in death, Canada kept its promise of dignity. The story ends with words that could have been spoken by any of those boys who came back. Imagine Hans Richter in 1985, age 56, sitting in his farmhouse near Lethbridge. His interviewer asks how he could love the country that held him prisoner. Hans thinks for a moment, then speaks. People ask me that question a lot. I tell them, Canada did not imprison me. Hitler did. Hitler and his lies put me behind that wire. Canada freed me, not just from the fence, but from everything I'd been taught, from the hate, from the lies, from the worst parts of myself. He pauses, looking out the window at fields of wheat turning gold under the summer sun. I came here as an enemy child soldier. Canada gave me the chance to become a man. That is a gift I could never repay. This is what makes the story remarkable. Boys refused to leave because they understood something many Canadians did not fully see. Their country had shown what a nation at its best could be: firm but fair, victorious but merciful, strong enough to defeat enemies, and confident enough to transform them into neighbors. The war ended in 1945, but for boys like Hans, Klaus, and Fritz, it did not truly end until they stood on Canadian soil again as free men. They chose the country that once held them captive because it had shown them what freedom actually meant. Not freedom to do whatever you want, but freedom to become whoever you could be. That lesson echoes forward through time, quiet but important, waiting for anyone willing to listen,